Hello, my name is Arthur, and in the last video we went over camera movement and how I got that working. I've revamped that and I've decided that having it on right mouse click wasn't working out. It required me to deselect the vehicle that was selected. There was no benefit to making the menu disappear. So I've changed the way the camera moves to middle mouse button. So now you have to hold the middle mouse button, and when you release it, it will return home. So we have it so we can look around and the camera will return home when you release the middle mouse button. And that way the menu stays up and a selected unit can stay selected, and I can set a destination as a result of moving the camera. Let's just send him back to where he was. So we'll have a look at something that hasn't been considered yet in this project, and that has to do with rotating things 360 degrees. So we're going to look at what the camera does here, and we're going to spin it around and spin it around and spin it around. So we're going to let it spin around a few times, and then we'll let it return home. And we're almost there. No. Okay, we're almost there now. Oh, no. So it's easy to see what's going on here. When the camera's rotating, it's winding that number around and around. So we had a rotation value of either minus 1,000 or positive 1,000. And we don't want it to do that. We want to contain that number. The same thing for a turret. A turret can be wound around in circles as well. And I was considering this because on a Jeep gun, it's not really appropriate for this gun to be able to turn 360 degrees. Generally, it's manned by a human sticking up right around where the camera is sticking up. So if this gun rotates 180 degrees, it's shooting the soldier that's manning it, basically. Or that guy is somehow standing on the hood of the vehicle. One or the other. So we're going to assume the guy doesn't stand on the hood of the vehicle, and we're going to treat the gun as though it should behave like the gun should when it's being manned. So that would involve giving it a maximum rotation. So that's what I've done is I've given the gun a maximum rotation. It's an export variable because turret will be on a tank, and the max rotation on a tank would be 180 degrees, which would allow it to go 360 degrees. So I've added in the clamp to go along with that and made an exception for that the clamp only works for a rotation max less than 180 degrees. So if the rotation maximum is set to 180 degrees, a turret will be able to rotate the full 360 degree circle. Yeah, maybe it's not clear why that's 180 degrees, but that's how it works. Each half of the circle is either positive or negative 180 degrees. That's part of the issue. Part of the issue when we're adding rotation degrees onto an existing value. This is what's creating the situation where the rotation value can be 270 degrees. Well, it should never be 270 degrees. 270 degrees is 180 degrees minus, let's see, I'm not sure on the math on that. Minus, I think it's 90 degrees. I believe the math is 90 degrees to get to 270. And where you would actually be at 270 degrees is, I believe you would be at minus 90. So what we need to do is to contain the rotation value. We can't let it go over 180 degrees and we can't let it go under minus 180 degrees. So along with the clamp, I've put in a containment function to contain that value. What that does is it will take the value if the ABS value, which is always a positive number, is greater than 180 degrees, it will subtract 360 degrees times this formula. And this formula is how you render the value either into a positive one if the value is positive or a negative one if the value is negative. By subtracting 360 degrees, if it's a positive value, that means value is greater than 180 degrees. And it needs to have 360 degrees subtracted from it to end up at the correct negative value that it should be at. The same thing happens if it's below 100 minus 180 degrees. Minus 360 degrees is subtracted, which is the same as adding 360 degrees, because when you subtract a negative, you're adding. So this function serves to contain the rotation within the proper values of positive 180 degrees as the max or negative 180 degrees as the minimum. So if we take and we copy this function, we'll copy that and we'll move it in with the camera. So we'll paste it in here. And we want to apply that to rotation degrees Y. So we'll take this, copy it. If rotation degrees Y, okay, so we're going to go rotation degrees Y equals contain rotation, and then paste the value in here. So that will return a value that has contained it within its proper values. So with that function in place, now if we start up and we go to wind the camera around, and we'll let it wind around a couple of times so it's clear that it works. And we'll come up just short. So I let go just short of coming around the circle. It's able to home by going in the shortest direction. Prior to putting in that function, it would have started going in the other direction. It would have went around 2 or 3 times, however many times we rounded the camera around to return home. Whereas now with that function in place, even if we wind it around a couple of times, it will be able to take the shortest route home when we release the mouse button because the numbers have been properly contained. So with that function in place, I figure the camera is working pretty good. Now, for a couple of other changes that I've made another change on the turret. And, excuse me. The change that I made is when it calls its shoot function, it's no longer sending a direction. It's only sending one value, that's the muzzle's global transform. So that's been changed in the function call here, which is also right here. So it's going to send its projectile and its position, which is its transform. Same thing in unit. Same thing in map. So we're sending a position. And then in bullet, it's instead of changing the translation, it's changing the global transform. So it's matching the global transform of the muzzle, which is pointing in the correct direction. And then its linear velocity is calculated along global transform basis z times speed, which is a negative value to make it move forward in the correct direction. By doing that and fixing how this was done, I was able to change my bullet. So I no longer have a round bullet. I made it a hemisphere so it has somewhat of a shell shape. And the change to the bullet script will allow me to do a rocket. So a rocket will come out of a rocket launcher and it will be pointing in the proper direction and move in the proper direction as determined by the muzzle of whatever shoots it. The second change that I made is to remove the muzzle flash off of the vehicle entirely. What was happening with the muzzle flash on the vehicle was it couldn't cycle fast enough for the gun timer. Now this gun is much faster than the turret on the tank was, so that problem would be even more prominent with the muzzle flash on the vehicle. So I figured the most appropriate place to put the muzzle flash and the explode was to have the map spawn them, but to have the bullet carry them. So the bullet carries its own flash, it carries its own explosion. So when it hits something, the bullet explodes. It carries those explosions over to the map. So rather than the lengthy explode function that I was running into with the tank experiment, where it was matching the vehicle type to the explosion, now the explosion is just delivered into the function with whoever's making the function call. So if a Jeep makes a function call to explode because it's died, it's going to send its explosion. There's going to be no sorting out. When a bullet does it, it sends its explosion. If I come up with some kind of a rocket, it will send its explosion, and there'll be no more sorting that out. Yeah, for the bullet, the flash and the explosion were actually just made from the same scene. So I basically just made a muzzle flash, and then I saved it as 50 caliber explode, and simply changed the direction. So I changed it from -Z to +Z. So now the flash emits in the direction the bullet is flying, and the explosion emits in the opposite direction. And that's all sorted out some issues with that. For the enemy vehicle, the easiest way I could find to create this vehicle was to simply take this vehicle, the player vehicle, save scene as, and I saved it as enemy vehicle 1. Then I opened my instance of Blender with my vehicle. I opened up the second camouflage, excuse me, opened up the second camouflage image, renamed the material to body_1, and overwrote the import file in Godot. So if we look in the Godot project file, where I started with an import that was the player vehicle material, what I have now is the enemy material, because that's how to get the material into Godot. I didn't actually use the export file. We don't need to use that. All I did was change the material on the vehicle to the appropriate material in the list, because importing it with the newly named material by giving it a different name, any of the other materials were already there, but the new name material was not. So it's only really the only thing that's changed is there's an extra material, and now the vehicle is has a different color than it did on the original import that we built the vehicle from. It has no effect on the vehicles that were built from that import. So I just loaded in the material, changed its layers to be appropriate for an enemy vehicle. So I have enemies in layer 5 this time, and player unit is in layer 15. I changed its group from player to enemy and changed its detection area so that it detects player units. And that's all the work that was required to make the enemy unit. It took about 5 minutes. Rather than taking the import and rebuilding all of the pieces on it, that's kind of the long way around. I kind of have the idea that I could now say vehicle 1, save as, create a second folder, vehicle 2, import, put an import folder into it, import a tank into the import folder, but use the duplicate of this scene saved as vehicle 2 to load in the meshes from the tank export, and just replace the meshes that are necessary to replace to turn the Jeep vehicle into a tank, and then modify collision shapes and the position of certain things to get them functioning properly. So that would be my intention. I'm going to get some tanks into the scene and look at making some explosions. And because we've already covered tanks, I don't think that's video worthy. And we've done the stationary also, so that's not really video worthy anymore. That's kind of just would be a repeat unless something gets done greatly different. So yeah, after that I'm likely to look at map, and I'm considering making one more type of unit, and I'll have to think about that one before I decide to make any announcement that I'm going to do something like that, because it's a little bit more difficult than these vehicles are. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. I believe that covers all of the differences in the script. I may not have mentioned, I might not, I'm not sure if I mentioned the difference in the map for the camera action. That's pretty basic stuff though. Instead of having the menu as a variable and changing the menu on and off and stuff like that, the only thing that's done now is the variable was changed in the camera to move instead of menu, and I put in a function to switch can move from true or false, and when the middle mouse button is pressed and held down, the value is true. When the button is released, it becomes false. So you're able to move the camera when you're holding down the button, and it returns home when you release it. So that's a pretty good simplification over having menus pop up and down and stuff like that. And having to deselect your unit to be able to move the camera was not convenient at all. So this way works better, and well, there's not really much to explain beyond that. It's a great simplification over what it was. So this is what it looks like here, and in the camera, it's really just, instead of if not menu, now it's if move is true, then it can move. Otherwise, it can return home. And the function is kind of obvious. So yeah, that's about it for this video. Mostly just explanation and a little bit of fixing of the camera. Hopefully it was helpful to people, and until the next video, take care.